This week on Thinking Biblically, historian Howard Margolian takes us back to the early days of Nazi Germany to help us understand the dynamics that led to the Holocaust. We then discuss if there's anything that we could learn to help us effectively navigate the days in which we live. Welcome to Thinking Biblically. My name is Alan Gilman. Thinking Biblically is a podcast dedicated to exploring how all Scripture speaks to all of life. Before I introduce this week's guest, I want to remind everyone to subscribe, to share, to like, and to comment. Howard Margolian is originally from Montreal, where he graduated with a BA in history from Concordia University. His studies in history continued as he went on to do both his master's and PhD from York University in Toronto. In his career as a professional historian, Howard worked for many years for the Canadian Department of Justice. I'll say that again, the Canadian Department of Justice's War Crimes Unit. He was a consultant to and expert witness for the federal government on war crimes cases. He was also for many years a consultant to the federal government and First Nations on Aboriginal history. Howard has written 2 books, both on war crimes in the Canadian context. The book Conduct Unbecoming was published in 1998, and it looks at the Canadian investigation of the brutal murder of over 150 Canadian soldiers after being captured by the Nazi SS. The book Unauthorized Entry was published in the year 2000, and it documents how Nazi war criminals leveraged holes in the Canadian immigration screening system to gain entry into this country. Howard was married to his first wife for 33 years. Randy tragically died of cancer a couple of years ago, but he's a newlywed again, having married Wendy Noble this past April. Howard is an avid runner, cycler, photographer, and hunter. Howard Margolian, welcome to Thinking Biblically.
Hi, Alan. Glad to be here.
Well, I'm so glad you're here too, and it's a multi-layered thing. I wanted to share with everyone, without getting into all the details, that before we get into some serious things in our talk today, I wanted to explain how we know each other. Howard and I went to high school together, Wager High School, in the Coast St. Luc suburb of Montreal. We were actually in music class together where we both played clarinet. And when Howard and I reconnected after about 48 years. It's kind of mind-blowing. I had to ask him the question, is he still playing clarinet? So I know I'm not.
No, it's been a long time. Yeah, I gave that up.
Yeah. I actually didn't really want to play clarinet, but that's another story. We're not here to talk about me, but it's still it's such a heartwarming thing for me to reconnect with somebody like you after all those years. And now we're going to be talking about, as I said, a very serious topic. And so here we go. So just to start off, one of your expertise is the early Nazi period. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I certainly, I guess the early period relating specifically to kind of anti-Jewish legislation in the Third Reich. I'm probably don't have quite the same level of expertise in that as I did about wartime Nazi activities, particularly in Eastern Europe, the former Soviet Union. But yes, I do. It was actually a required part of my study during the MA and PhD years. So yeah, I can make my way through some of that.
Yeah. So one of the things that I've wondered about, and I've mentioned it before on this podcast, is our people. In case it isn't clear, both Howard and I are Jewish. Always, when I talk to people about my younger life, my growing up years, I often forget to mention that almost all of our social interaction was within a Jewish context. Coast St. Luc is one of the most densest Jewish populations in the world. And so for both of us, how we grew up is like we lived and breathed a Jewish life. And so as Jewish people, we say never again with regard to what happened to our people in the Holocaust. but for a long, long time, I've given thought to, what does that mean? Never again. Well, of course, we don't want it to happen, but if we're not aware of the social dynamics in the various places we live through the development of history, if we're not aware of what's going on, how can we ever actually bring about never again? The other thing is the chances of an exact thing like the Holocaust and all the ways that it unfolded ever happening again just like that. History repeats itself, but it doesn't. It's not like I used to do, or maybe still do. People put a song on repeat and you get the exact same thing happening over and over and over again. That's not how history repeats itself. It repeats itself similarly, but in different ways. And if we don't fully understand the dynamics that lead to such atrocities, how could we be confident that we will make sure that something similar doesn't happen again? And so we got together for coffee a few weeks ago, and we had this conversation where I asked you, like, what were the social dynamics that led to what might be the greatest of all atrocities, and whether it's the greatest or not, but the annihilation, the purposeful, systematic annihilation of 6 million Jewish people in Europe under the Nazi regime, and the killing of so many millions more. How does in that day, Germany, which been through great trouble, but one of the most sophisticated, intelligent societies up to that point in world history. I don't know if that's an exaggeration. You could correct me. How did such a place become the soil of this level of dehumanization and brutality? So maybe you could map out for us what were the dynamics, what was going on in Germany that led to the atrocity of the Holocaust.
Well, I guess it's in a way, it's two things really. You are correct. I mean, certainly Germans themselves, since the Second World War, have been asking that question. How did we get to 1945? Because it was a very technologically advanced, economically advanced, even socially advanced, somewhat politically authoritarian for much of its history, and certainly after Germany was united fully as one national entity in 1870. The government they had a parliament and there were elections, but it was a rather top-down kind of political system. But in other ways, yes, very advanced, very, in some ways, more advanced in terms of what they did in terms of social welfare than in countries we tend to think of more as Western liberal democracies like France or England, other places. The First World War was a cataclysm, and it was a cataclysm for other countries than Germany. Empires fell. With Russia, you have the end of Tsarist rule and the replacement after a short period with a kind of a democratic government with a communist dictatorship. Austria-Hungary, this massive, if weakened empire, collapses completely and is fragmented and turned into a bunch of small nation states. The Ottoman Empire, another, perhaps weakening empire by the time the First World War broke out, also collapses at the end of the war and is replaced again by sort of smaller, much more national and ethnically oriented countries. Germany loses some territories. Germany had small colonial possessions. They did lose parts of their territory in Europe. Alsace-Lorraine, which they had conquered in 1870, returns to France. There are some eastern territories that they lose. It's still it's a large country still in 1918 in the center of Europe, but there was also great social dislocation as a result of losing the war. The monarchy, or the imperial monarchy, if you want to call it that, of Kaiser Wilhelm II collapses. He goes into exile. It's replaced with a democracy, which also had a democratic constitution. But there are great fractures in that society as a result of losing the war, because there's a significant element in that society which believed that Germany didn't lose the war because of what happened on the battlefield. They lost it because there were communists, Jewish war shirkers and profiteers. I mean, there was a whole slew of people who Germans, let's say, of a more conservative bent, would have blamed for the losses. Now, that's not true. Germany lost on the battlefield. I think most military historians would agree. But this idea of kind of finding blame inside the country became a powerful weapon, I guess, for people on the more conservative side or the right-wing side of German politics.
Let me stop. Can I just stop you there for a minute? Because one thing kind of moved into the other. So I just want things to be clear. So prior to World War I, Europe and into Russia, there were, not that they were all empires, but there was a lot more. Let me say it differently. Following World War I, there was this incredible fracture that started happening, and a breaking up of larger nation groups. And so you had is fracturization a word? Of European, the whole new European national thing had changed. I'm not saying, you could say it better than me.
Well, it's just that what you actually had. I mean, if we're eventually, of course, going to have to mention Adolf Hitler's name. Adolf Hitler was born in a small town in Austria, but Austria was the seat of what was then the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He's born in the 1880s, and it was still an empire which ruled over vast parts of sort of Central and especially Southeastern Europe. And it's a multinational empire.
Right. So the word I was looking for,
Poles.
The word So Europe had become fragmented into smaller nation states.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. And so that was happening. That was new.
Yes, that would have been that was new. These empires, these multinational empires, had been around for, in some cases, hundreds of years.
Right,
and then so suddenly there's this great splitting up.
All over the place, sort of thing.
Yeah,
and okay, then then you moved on to the loss of the war by the Germans. And you're saying it's clear they lost on the battlefield. They lost the war they were fighting, but in the German mind, they were already beginning to scapegoat people like the Jewish people and others for their loss.
Well, there were. I mean, even during, to give you an example, during the First World War, the German Jews were very patriotic. They were very well integrated and assimilated into German society. They saw themselves as Germans first and as Jews second. Jewishness just happened to be, well, this is cultural, religious, whatever. But they saw that. So when in August, the First World War begins in earnest, I mean, the Jews, like everybody else in Germany, they're rushing to join up. That everyone thought it was going to be a short war. How silly was that? But they join up. Basically virtually everyone in the Jewish community who could serve did serve. The Jews, as a percentage of the German population, actually suffer casualties at a slightly higher rate in the First World War, and also are decorated for bravery at a slightly, if you look purely with numbers. Sometimes these numbers are meaningless because there were only 500,000 to 600,000 Jews living in Germany, a country of well over 60 million, at the time of the First World War. But what happened is, as Germany began to suffer defeats on the battlefield, particularly from 1916 onward, when it was clear that they were not going to win the war quickly, that they were suffering huge numbers of casualties. The German economy was beginning to suffer. It was reaching its kind of the end point of its ability to continue with massive war production. Even the German high command, or certain people in it, one of the things they did, they invoked this sort of, we're going to see how many Jews are actually serving in the German army. And the assumption amongst all these generals was, oh, well, the Jews, they're shirkers and cowards and they're profiteers. Of course, what they found was that the Jews, as I said, were actually serving in exactly the same percentages as all the other Germans, and were being decorated for bravery and were dying on the battlefield and in trenches. So they actually suppressed this. But that was during the war. There was already an attempt to scapegoat Jews, almost like if you're a right winger in Germany, it's almost like you want it as an insurance policy in your pocket. Well, if we do actually lose this thing, we'll blame the Jews, right? They didn't step up. They're profiteers, whatever. It was all nonsense. It was rubbish.
When we met for coffee a few weeks ago, you didn't bring up this part of the story, and so I just want to park here for a second.
Sure.
Because in understanding the dynamics, we would need to ask the question: why already were the Jews the ones to scapegoat? What was happening in because. And a lot of people understand, and you did mention this, that German people were were quite assimilated into German society. As you said, they saw themselves as Germans first and Jews second. That wasn't true in all Jewish experience in Europe, but that was very true in Germany. And yet there was this layer of what would become known as anti-Semitism at work in German society. Do you understand any of the roots of that? Like, why was it
I mean, there's two kinds of anti-Semitism that at a certain point sort of cross paths with one another. There's the traditional anti-Semitism, which goes back basically almost millennia. And I mean, obviously, as religious prejudice or bigotry, that existed in what became the German national state. So in all these little kingdoms and principalities that eventually united or were united mainly by military means to become the German state in 1870, that's already there. But probably even 30 years before that, while German society may have still had anti-Semitic tendencies, it was also facing from outside, and particularly France, it was being modernized. Some of it is economic modernization, but even politically, to some extent, it's being modernized. And so some of that religious bigotry, it's not that it completely disappears, but it kind of becomes almost this, okay, there's the Jews rejected Christ, and there's all that stuff. But then, of course, what you also have with modernization, you also have the rise of more nationalist movements based on ethnicity, or what is seen as ethnicity or race. And at some point, and I can't identify exactly when that happens because I think it's something that happens over time, there are elements in German society, and particularly within the German elite, which begin to equate Jewishness not with a kind of a separateness because of religion, but a separateness because of racial characteristics. Again, this probably is, it should have been seen even then as complete nonsense. If you actually, I've seen photographs of the Jewish soldiers who served in the German army in the First World War, and many of them are just as blonde haired. I can't, they're black and white pictures, so I can't tell if they're blue eyed, but many of them, like, they are indistinguishable from a sort of a facial or whatever, or a body type point of view from other Germans. The people who wanted to use this racial separateness, which is largely nonsense, but people who wanted to use this basically, made things up. So they would put out, this began in the later 19th century. It was obviously much more prevalent, not in German society generally, but in right-wing circles. They'd put out these kind of images of Jews, looking like completely overweight, huge hook nose kind of people who, are milking the German economy just for their own benefit. You see some of this propaganda, which then gets repeated, of course, much more widely during the Nazi era. So there's always anti-Semitism there, but it changes in fundamental ways as you get towards the end of the 19th century. It becomes more, let's say, racialized, and maybe has less to do with the older religious prejudices of people in certain parts of Germany.
So there's this bit of a tension here. So during the war, First World War, you have this layer of anti-Semitism, and yet the Jewish people were well integrated in the society and were, as you said, proportionally represented in the military.
Yeah.
And so for the most part, as far as the Jewish people are concerned, we're Germans, we're fighting on behalf of the Germans. Then the war ends, and what happens?
Well, the German army, in other words, what happened after the First World War what happened after, let's put it this way, what happened after the Second World War, where Germany was occupied, and basically, what was left of Germany was occupied by various occupying armies, did not really happen after the First World War, which tended then, so you had the French army they took back Alsace-Lorraine. They did occupy certain areas, the Ruhr region of coal mining. But basically, when the German army returned from losing the First World War, you don't have this same devastation within Germany proper. You don't have this feeling of, oh my God, there's French soldiers everywhere, there's Russian soldiers everywhere, there's British soldiers everywhere, as was the case after the Second World War. So again, this tends to feed that narrative. Well, our boys are coming back, but like they still have all their weapons. What's going on here? How did we lose this? And it kind of, so it tends again to feed this. It was called the stab in the back theory. That's what both people at the time and then historians subsequently called it. And they didn't just blame Jews. They also blamed German left-wing politicians, German communists, obviously, even liberals, more liberal-minded German politicians. The blame game starts as the German army returns. The German economy was on the verge of collapse by the time Germany lost the war and surrendered in November of 1918. But things then go from bad to worse. There is an attempt to bring in, and ultimately what was called the Weimar Constitution, because it was framed by German politicians at the city of Weimar in Germany, is a very democratically oriented constitution. It provides, for the individual rights and provides for parliamentary elections and for Basically, it's kind of proportional, a form of proportional representation. So really, even small parties can get a few seats in the German parliament if they win enough votes. But what I meant was, when things go from bad to worse is, of course, they surrender in 1918. There's an armistice, but then for the next year or so, there are these negotiations amongst the Allied powers about a final peace treaty with Germany. And that became known in 1919, when it was adopted, as the Versailles Treaty, because, of course, it was signed in Versailles, France. That imposes huge economic and military disabilities on Germany, on this new republic that has just formed. This republic that is already drowning in wartime debt, beginning to see the serious inflation in the economy. And now you've got these Allied powers, Britain and France in particular, who are saying, well, the Germans are going to have to pay for the war. They started this damn thing, so we're gonna milk their economy. They're gonna have to pay us in perpetuity, for the next 50 years. And so there are these war reparations paid by Germany. Of course, the German armed forces are reduced to almost nothing, because there's this fear, particularly on the French side, that the Germans, if they're allowed to grow their army again, they're going to do the same thing that they did in 1914. So you have on top of the initial shock of losing, you also have already great wounding of national pride, this feeling that we are being blamed for something that maybe all the European powers should take some responsibility for. And of course, you've got greater and greater economic dislocation, which resulted, it kind of came to a head in 1923. I don't know if you've ever seen photographs of what was going on in certain German cities, but the inflation was so bad that you basically see people pushing wheelbarrows full of Reichsmarks, which are essentially worthless. And they're using it to maybe buy a half a loaf of bread, right? So some ludicrous amount of money, right? Just to maybe buy enough bread to get you through the week. So, I mean, that's part of what happens. Now, after that, I know we've talked about this when we met a few weeks ago, but after that, I mean, once the German economy in 1923-24 begins to kind of, the German politicians of the day begin to try to bring some sanity and control, that and the fact that there is some money starting to come in from foreign investors, particularly in the United States, there's a period of several years in the 1920s when actually the German economy begins to recover. And people start to think, oh, okay, maybe this republic isn't such a bad idea. Yeah, we're still PO'd about losing the war. We still don't understand why we have to pay these reparations, particularly to France. But it started to look like, okay, maybe we're going to find a way out of this. And then, of course, what happens in 1929? Stock market crash in the United States. What happens in 1930? Great Depression. And then you have another round of economic. So just when Germany appears to be coming out of it, you have an even greater, arguably, a greater economic cataclysm. And of course, by 1930, of course, what's happening is once that happens, parties that had really been, like the Nazis, that had really been, but other very right-wing and in some cases anti-Semitic parties, which had really been marginalized in the 1920s, all of a sudden are getting votes again, because people are, again, looking for somebody to blame. They don't understand why their current governments, usually coalitions of different sort of center-right or center-left parties, don't seem to be able to manage the economy and these problems. And so they start looking elsewhere. Now, there was also the Communist Party, I should say, at that time also saw an increase in their vote. So you get the extremes starting again to rise in Germany on both the left and the right, but more on the right.
I know this might be a difficult one to answer, but do you think the motive for something different, something new, something other, was that being driven more by blame, or we need an alternative because the current thing isn't working?
Well, I mean, that may be a question actually more for a political scientist than a historian. But I would say, I mean, you have a democracy, but it is, even when it's working, it is beset by some pretty extreme people and pretty extreme movements. Now, in the 1920s, as I said, those movements tend to recede because the economy begins to improve. Some of it is blame. I mean, a lot of Germans, and I should point out again, if you read the letters and the diaries of a lot of German Jews, particularly those who managed to get out of Germany after Hitler came to power and went to the United States or Britain or elsewhere, they were asking themselves, why is this happening to Germany? Like, why is the world picking on us? So again, they are as nationalist and they are as victimized, whether rightly or wrongly, as the rest of German society. German Jews are as patriotic as the Germans, and they're saying, like, this can't continue. I guess that's one of those things where you have to say, particularly if you were Jewish in Germany, be careful what you wish for, because if you are looking for something other than the Weimar Republic, unfortunately in Germany there were, what were you going to pick? Well, you pick a communist dictatorship, or you pick these right-wing kind of, some more nationalist than others, but they're, these very right-wing parties, among of which the Nazis for a long time were just one of many. So sometimes it's better to stay the course, but I think there were just too many factors in Germany that pushed too many people to say, I don't want to lose my job. I want to be able to feed my family. I don't want my savings to be worth literally nothing. These guys are saying they can do it. Yeah, they've got some weird ideas, the Nazis I'm talking about. Yeah, they've got some weird ideas about the Jews, and they've got some weird ideas about some other stuff. But you know what? They say they can do it. Maybe I should park my vote there. I mean, one of the things I think what I'm saying is, I know we discussed this, is these things happen usually incrementally. They don't happen necessarily all at once at the point of a bayonet. It's the breakdown, political dissolution, social breakdown, I think happens over time. When we look back on it in retrospect, what happened in Germany seems to happen pretty quickly from the end of the First World War to, basically 1933. It's about 15 years. But it's to me, I would still say it's kind of incremental. And there were things that, had they happened differently, then the Nazis may have just remained a footnote in history. But you had two economic cataclysms. You had the great inflation from about 1920 to 1923 in Germany. And then basically a few years later, you have the worldwide economic collapse, the Great Depression, which hits Germany pretty hard. That's not to say it didn't hit the United States, Canada, other places just as hard. But German society, I think, was maybe the democratic impulses were maybe less robust there than they were in countries that in the end never really went to either to the extreme left or the extreme right.
So in Germany, you at the time you had both economic struggles and you explained pretty well the ups and downs of that. Then there was also carrying the shame of what had occurred following the loss of World War I. But what we're not looking at, it's not as if there was this Nazi revolt that, that just arisen sort of out of nowhere and then took over. That happened incrementally.
Right. I should say there was an attempt by the Nazi Party in 1923 to do a coup d'état, and it failed miserably.
Okay. So
they try it in Bavaria, and basically a few Bavarian policemen put a stop to that with some well-placed rifle shots. Hitler gets arrested, thrown in jail for about a year as a kind of a seditious individual. And actually, that was one of the things that convinced Hitler and some of the others in the Nazi leadership, okay, we cannot overthrow the German state by force because we will lose that game every time. So that's when they begin to adopt, this, okay, we'll play the political game. We'll try to get people elected to the parliament. Their intention was once they got control of the parliament, their intention was that will be the last election.
But this is so important, I think. So Hitler and company play their card in Bavaria. So people know who they are. They decide to change tactic, and it works.
Yeah, but they had to be patient, obviously.
But it still worked. People knew
it didn't work in the 1920s because they had very few seats in the German parliament. They only begin to get a lot of seats after the Depression sets in Germany in 1930.
But then the question is, but if the population knew the nature of this thing because they had played their cards the way they did in Bavaria, how could it be that they get more and more power that ends up resulting in them taking over? Like, why would people vote for them in sufficient numbers?
Okay. In some ways, first of all, some of it is just kind of the Nazis in the 1920s are very clever about the way they play the political game. The messaging never really changes, though. Depending on the audience they're speaking to, sometimes they mute it, right? Hitler and some of the other Nazi leadership know in the 1920s that if they're going to go talk to a chamber of commerce or they're going to talk to, some big German industrialists, if they start this ranting and raving, oh, the Jews, this, and the commies, that, they know those people are not going to listen and they're never going to listen to them again. So they have to moderate the message or kind of leave that part of the message out. Some audiences would be more receptive than others, but really what the Nazis were very adept at doing was playing on people's fears. Fear of today, fear of tomorrow, fear of their neighbors in some cases, whether they were Jewish or not, and maybe even kind of this almost like self-hatred, like why is this happening? What's wrong with us as Germans, right? First we lose this war where we at the beginning at least we were winning, and then now we can't seem to manage an economy. It can't be our fault. It's got to be somebody else's fault. It's France's fault. It's those perfidious British. It's the Jews here. It's somebody else's fault. It's not ours. And so the Nazis were very adept at playing to the audience they were speaking to. So if you're talking to a bunch of farmers in Bavaria and you're the Nazis, you have one message. If you're talking to a bunch of, big industrialists in Dusseldorf, you're going to have a different message and it's going to be delivered differently. It's not going to be this shrieking, Hitler shrieking and yelling. He's not even going to wear his brown shirt. He's probably going to come in a suit and a tie and speak very in modulated tones to satisfy that audience. In some ways, the Germans were just better at the Nazis were maybe just better at mass politics than some of the other parties were.
Were there no voices saying, but he's a monster, he's a monster?
Well, there were, even in the German elite, because ultimately the Nazis never get enough votes or seats in the parliament to have a majority in the parliament. They get into power in late January 1933, because Hitler is appointed chancellor, because there is a kind of an escape clause in the Weimar Constitution, which allows, in certain circumstances, the president of the Reich, which at that time was Paul Hindenburg, First World War general and hero, but very elderly, very decrepit already. And they basically appoint them because they don't see any alternative. And in fact, Hitler's first cabinet has actually more conservative, more traditional German conservatives, right wingers, but not Nazis, than it does Nazis. I think Goering was in his first cabinet, and there were a couple of other lower level positions. But most of Hitler's cabinet, while he's chancellor, are actually just old line German conservatives. And those people, like everyone else, mistakenly thought, we can control this guy. He's useful. He's got this big base of support, but we'll control him. Maybe in a few years we'll discard him. Or we'll marginalize him. For now, he's useful. We don't really have an alternative on the political side. We're certainly not going to go to the Social Democrats or the communists. Like, we're not going to rely on them to have to make some kind of parliamentary majority. And again, this was part of the underestimation, particularly by the German elite of the day, of Hitler and the Nazis. So some people, yes, may have recognized him as what you called a monster. I think most people kind of saw him as this slightly odd, bellowing sort of, right-wing crank who had a political base, who had enough support that they could get things done, perhaps, without sometimes bypassing Parliament or whatever.
So something's not clear.
It's not like it. The monstrosity of Hitler comes after he takes full power.
So before we get to that,
because we have the benefit of hindsight.
Yeah, right.
No,
but who is, when you were talking about the we, and how the Nazi Party become, and you even said they weren't all Nazis in this group that Hitler was leading, and that, to me, that's still not clear. So, who was the we that gave them the ball to carry politically, thinking that, at least they can get things done?
Well, it's the German presidency. It's to some extent President Hindenburg, but really it's kind of the people around him. So it's both the bureaucracy that's around him. Again, they are traditional German conservatives. They are not Nazis. They are right-wingers.
If I understand correctly, the parliament, therefore, did have all these various parties, and nobody could get a good enough coalition to try to get things done. And yet then you had this other up and coming group that represented a larger base and looked like if they would hand Hitler and company the ball, at least they can get some good things done.
Right.
Is that it? Okay. And they were willing to put up with what they thought was nonsense. And after a while, we could probably just discard this guy once we kind of get our footing and this sort of thing. Is that what's going on?
I mean, to a certain extent, yeah. And you have to remember, I mean, in much of Germany, a lot of people may have had views about the Jews, but many of them would never have met a Jew. I mean, the Jews were largely concentrated in a few large cities that, like I said, there were probably less than 600,000 of them in a very, a country with 60, 70 million people. So a lot of people would never, they would have had that traditional maybe prejudice about the Jews, but they may never have met one.
Right. That's similar. That's similar. That proportion similar to Canada.
Right.
I want to get a picture of it.
Right. I mean, so I'm not saying that there weren't people. I think certainly people on the political left, not the communists, but the social democrats, who represented probably the second largest political grouping after the Nazis in 1932, 33. They would have been the ones who had the second most seats in the German Reichstag or parliament. Some of them certainly knew what Hitler was, but nobody is really at that point conceiving of, oh my God, first of all, I guess Mein Kampf, which Hitler wrote, where he lays out pretty much his plan for everything, including European conquest. Probably it's one of the most purchased and least read books, in German history, right? So it was like 900 pages long. It's very difficult to read because Adolf is kind of all over the map, and he actually had help writing it. I can't even imagine if he had written it entirely on his own, what that draft would have looked like. It probably would have been incoherent. I think Rudolf Hess, who was his secretary in the early years of the Nazi Party, helped him write it. And I guess he sort of made some parts at least, sound somewhat rational, or at least somewhat coherent, let's say. But so people are not thinking, oh my God, if we vote this guy in, or we insert this guy in, oh my God, what, the first thing he's going to do is declare war on Russia or France, or the first thing he's going to do is start, interning Jews in concentration. Like they're not thinking in those terms because it's not immediately apparent. Like I said, these things happen incrementally. And I guess if there are any lessons to be learned from history, because one of the things you talked early on about, how history sometimes repeats itself. To me, I never think history repeats itself, but there are certainly similar things can happen. But to me, the important thing as a historian is always to look at context, and context matters. There is a very specific context to what is going on in Germany, particularly in the early 1930s. And context is not excuses. Like, I want to make that clear. I'm not saying that, oh, if only for a different context, terrible things wouldn't have happened. But I think in order to understand what happened there, I think one does have to have some understanding of the social, the political, and maybe particularly the economic context. And also maybe, yes, this idea of kind of national humiliation, national shame, national victimization. Why are these allied powers, even 15 years later, still pulling money out of Germany, forcing us to pay these reparations? I mean, France's economy is up and running again. Britain's is. Why are we still paying millions and millions of Reichsmarks every year to these powers? The war was over a decade and a half ago. So that, again, it's not an excuse. But you could maybe, if you try to put yourself in the place of the average German, not the elite, not members of the military, not the political extremists, but just the average German, maybe a lower middle class, has a trade, got 2 or 3 kids, just trying to get by. And it just looks, even if it doesn't happen to him, he sees his neighbor losing his job and maybe his house. He sees his own savings, starting to wither away. He sees kind of maybe a way of life, even sort of kind of seeming to disappear and being replaced with something that he finds alien or whatever. And so he says to himself, I don't know. Yeah, this guy worries me a little bit. He seems like a bit wild at times, and some of the things he says, but I don't know. Maybe I should park my vote there. Because he at least seems to have a plan, and he's talking to me. He's saying, I feel your pain, to quote Bill Clinton, I think at a certain point when he was running in 1992 the first time. I mean, Hitler never said, I feel your pain, but that was sometimes the message I think that German voters got. Yeah, he understands it. those German industrialists, they don't care about me. The communists don't care about me. The middle level power parties, the Social Democrat, they don't seem to care about me. This guy's talking to me, So again, I have to say there is evidence that even in 1933, in the last free election in Germany, there were some Jews who voted for Hitler, despite the obvious anti-Semitic messages and messaging. So,
so on balance, even for some of these Jewish people, when they weighed the good versus the bad, to them the good was significantly outweighed the bad to the point that they could vote for him.
Yeah. Now, I mean, I would say probably most Jews tended to vote for kind of the more centrist parties. There was a Catholic party that apparently got, because they were sort of middle of the road, they tended to get the Jewish vote. There would have been a lot of Jews who voted for the Social Democrats. There were some sort of right of center parties that were not crazy right of center that the Jews would have voted for. But I mean, you have to remember, again, a lot of Jews, they had been through the First World War. They felt the same humiliation. They felt an obligation to the German soldiers, including the more than 12,000 of their Jewish brothers who were buried in places like Belgium and France, who had died fighting for Germany. They felt some obligation, like that this can't continue, this humiliation, this whatever. So, yeah, I mean, some people, even as late as then, knowing the messaging, would have said, well, yeah, but, that other party I used to vote for, some of their candidates also said some nasty things about the Jews. Yeah, it'll pass. Yeah, even if he gets in, he's not going to do all the things, that everybody is warning us about. We're not going to lose our rights.
The German, so did you mean that though? So Howard, what he said, everybody's warning us about, and this is one of the things I'm most concerned about is, where are the voices who are saying, this is dangerous. We're dealing with a monster here. Because for the most part, I'm hearing that people were generally aware of, we'll call them his crazy ideas, but were willing to put up with them for a bunch of reasons because the good outweighed the bad. But it sounds like there were there warnings? No.
Well, there would have been warnings. Certainly, like I said, there were certain social democratic politicians, many who had been in parliament long-standing, who raised some alarm bells about what the Nazis were talking about. But it wasn't necessarily really so much in the kind of the realm just of anti-Semitic policy. It might have been just more generally about, do you really want to give this crank control of the German economy? Do you really want, these brown shirts, this kind of paramilitary organization that he's built up? Do you really want them replacing the good, solid German police? But again, a lot of, like I said, even some Jews, and certainly a lot of people who may have had reservations about Hitler, also believed, well, but the German elite, the German army, they're going to keep this guy in check. So yeah, it's in the end, a lot of what he's talking about is just going to stay as rhetoric, right? It's something to get elected. It's not ever really going to happen. And of course, it does happen. But even then, it happens slowly, especially in the first couple of years of Hitler's rule.
So
I think that's, I think that's the context.
Just, getting a little understanding and, talking today, we could be talking for hours on this and then get into so many of the details. But are we doomed if these sorts of dynamics of, even when a person publishes a book with his agenda and plays his card in Bavaria, and people are going, well, we think he's a crank and all the rest, and yet he still ends up getting this support, and the beast massively manifests. Like, what hope do we have of navigating a world in which this sort of thing? I don't mean to be laughing. This is very serious. How do we navigate a world with these kinds of dynamics?
Well, I mean, I guess I would say there were people, even in, let's say, in the United States, there were radio broadcasts after the Great Depression set in. And particularly after Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected in 1932, there were voices in the United States that were spewing all kinds, including anti-Semitic hatred and hatred against the Roosevelt administration because it was felt they were using government too heavy-handedly to try to deal with the Great Depression. So there were voices, there were radio broadcasts. People heard these things, but somehow in a country like the United States, that kind of stuff, while it did reach a level of popularity in the 1930s that it had never attained prior to and has never attained since, it never resulted in a kind of a collapse of the society or a degeneration, let's say, of the society into people, sort of not trusting one another and willing to vote for crazies. So again, that's why I'm saying there's a context. And even though I would argue that the Great Depression hit the United States at least as hard as it hit Germany, with maybe less initially, at least until Roosevelt's administration begins to do certain things from a social welfare point of view. Initially, at least, I would argue that maybe the Great Depression hit the Americans harder than it did the Germans. That's not to say the economy in Germany, because it was a mess. And there was widespread unemployment beginning in 1930, 31. But the reactions were somewhat different. So I think there will always be, particularly in more democratic societies, there will always be crazies. Always. There will always be people on the fringes who propagate or buy into wild conspiracy theories, who advocate the most vile kinds of, whether it's racist policies or other, things. But I think contextually, I would point, for example, to the United States, and I would say, well, why was it in an economy that was arguably at least as bad, if not worse, than the German economy in the 1930s? Why did those groupings, while they certainly gained support, and then once the war started, of course, people like Charles Lindbergh saying we need to stay out of it. This is a problem. We're being forced into the war by the Jews or by the British or by the communists or whatever. There were large movements of people who bought into this kind of stuff, but they never became anywhere close to a political majority. So why is that? And I would argue, it's context, right? There are maybe different political impulses at that time amongst the average American person. Obviously, if you lost your job and you're going to a soup kitchen to feed your family, yeah, you may be the kind of fodder that groups like Nazis and others and communists might want to try to convert to their cause, because they'll say, it's not your fault, right? It's somebody else is causing this. But the fact that they could never really gain much of a footing in the United States at the same time as there's a Nazi party, which does in Germany. And of course, once they get power, there's no more elections, and then they can impose gradually a totalitarian dictatorship on Germany. But again, I hate to keep repeating myself, but I would go back to context. I think context matters.
Right. So I don't know how.
I guess what you're asking me, am I worried about, democratic societies here? Yeah, I do. But I guess I'm not as worried as I would have been if I had looked at Germany in the 1930s, early 1930s.
So why? Okay, so you're saying you're contrasting the U.S. and Germany at the time of the Depression. Both countries have people unemployed in the food line. Mm-hmm. Both had some similar influences, but wait, yes, similar or not similar? Similar and different.
Well, I mean, obviously, there was a German-American Bund, for example. These were people of German origin living in the United States, probably mostly American citizens by that point, but maybe first generation or second generation. And they adopted a lot of the kind of Hitlerite stuff in the 1930s. They wore sort of, the same kinds of paramilitary stuff when they would do marches. And they would do a lot of this stuff in New York City because they saw that as the hub of world Jewry, right? They would say this stuff. But I mean, I would just say that, a lot, there was an American context to all of that. And while people may have, it's possible that some people did certainly fall prey to that kind of messaging in the United States, it was nothing like what happened in Germany and to some extent in fascist Italy, because again, of different, sort of a different political culture, maybe a different culture more generally. I mean, that's why I always hesitate to try to draw too many parallels. And that's why I brought up the issue.
But you're actually saying no. But you're actually saying you're not drawing a parallel completely because the United States didn't go that route.
Well, they didn't go that route. So then the question becomes, well, if conditions are just as bad in the United States in, let's say, 1933 as they are in Germany and maybe in some other parts of Europe in 1933, why does Germany go one way and the United States pretty much stay the course? Even though there are certainly voices in the United States that are saying, no, what those Germans are doing, that's the way we need to go.
Okay, so that didn't get enough traction in the US, but it got complete traction in Germany. And the thing that I'm most concerned about is where are the people of goodwill? Where are the people that see what's going on, that are truly concerned, and how come their voices get silenced?
Okay, I mean, I'm gonna raise an issue that I think we talked about, and it's not really historical. It's actually very recent. I will not comment on other people's vaccination status or whatever. Just as an example, okay?
Okay.
I do not like vaccine mandates. I don't like politicians saying that, oh, you have to do it for the good of the country and all that. I thought that was nonsense right from the beginning. But I have been vaccinated 3 times. And I actually feel really stupid about it, particularly the third vaccine, because of course it was a half dose of the first 2. The same one. So, 5 variants ago or whatever.
And by the way, folks, there's nothing about COVID or vaccines in my notes here. And in our prep time, we didn't talk about COVID or vaccines. Howard, you're on your own at this point. Continue.
All I'm saying is so even though I had great misgivings about those policies, I went along with them. Now I've decided I'm not going to anymore because it seems to me now pseudoscientific, but for basically more than a year, I did. And I consider myself somebody who's, reasonably intelligent, who looks at things carefully, who doesn't just automatically do what the government says I should do. And yet I did it. So I guess what I'm trying to do, maybe I'm appealing for sympathy, not so much for me, but for the average German, like I said, who voted, who supported the Nazis, whether he or she had misgivings about them, however great or small those misgivings were. because it was a way to go along to get along. So this is not, I understand this is not about vaccines, but I'm just taking a tiny little thing where I have, if you speak to my friends, if you speak to Wendy, like if you speak to people, they will tell you how critical I have been about all of this. And yet 3 times I allowed, basically, I said, well, yeah, but for whatever, for my good, or maybe not my good, but to go along, to get along, I'll do this. So, and I'm not living in that kind of situation that the average German worker was, or the average German farmer, or the average German office worker, who had real fear for their jobs, for their livelihoods, for, can I even feed my family? What is the future going to hold? So I guess what I'm saying is, given what I did in a very small way, I kind of understand. Yeah, they voted. And I even understand maybe those patriotic Jews who, even as late as 1932, 33, said, yeah, this guy's a bit of a whack job, but I don't think there's anybody else on the political horizon who is saying anything that is going to solve the problems the way this guy is. Now, were these people all wrong? Yes, they were wrong. And of course, with hindsight, which is why I brought up the vaccine thing, because I'm saying now with hindsight, I was wrong, but let's move past that. I'm just saying, like, it's very easy for intelligent, rational, patriotic, basically decent people to persuade themselves about something that they later then regret. I'm sure many of the people who voted for Hitler, even before the Allied bombs began to fall on their cities, I'm sure there were many people who said, oh boy, what was I thinking back in 33? What was I thinking? Why this guy? Really? But of course, by then, if you said that publicly, the Gestapo would pay you a visit to your house and you might disappear. I hope that, like I said,
I get what you're saying.
I was just using it as an example, a small example of going along to get along.
But are we doomed to that? Do you think we're doomed to that? Is there a way? And of course, this is not about whether to be vaccinated or not to be vaccinated. It has to do with, and what you're saying is, even you, whose normal posture is a certain way, you end up surprising yourself about a decision, about a medical procedure that you now regret. What is it about human beings that do this go along to get along? And is there any hope for us? And you mentioned you're not a political scientist. I don't know if, do you have, can you answer a question like this? But, well, in your study of history, have you not encountered people that had what it took to stand despite what the crowds were doing?
Yes, there were in Nazi Germany.
And what makes
the problem was there weren't enough of them.
Right. And what makes the difference?
And there weren't enough of them early on. Obviously, once a totalitarian regime gets in place and it controls all the different apparatuses, particularly the various security apparatuses of that state, it is extremely difficult to overthrow it from inside. It's not impossible. And the book that you had me read by Rod Dreher about Live Not by Lies, he talks about that. That people did small things in their own way to resist, and he's talking more about what happened in the Warsaw Pact countries, the Eastern Bloc under communism. So people did things, but it wasn't they didn't pick up right. Occasionally they did. In Hungary, there was a revolt in 1956, ruthlessly and quickly suppressed by the Red Army. In 1968, there was actually in Czechoslovakia, there was a peaceful there was a move towards kind of trying to liberalize the politics amongst certain members of the Communist Party there. And of course, what happens? The Warsaw Pact comes in with tanks and soldiers and, basically suppresses that. So once a totalitarian regime is in place, you are not likely going with force to be able to overthrow it. But there are ways to resist it. But again, it becomes a question of at what point do people reach the point where they say it's no longer enough to go along to get along. So, okay, after 3 vaccines, I reached that point because I realized how absurd it was for me to get the 3rd vaccine, which was a half dose of the same vaccine that I got way back, which was 5 variants ago. So different people in Nazi Germany, in the Warsaw Pact countries, in the Soviet Union probably reached that decision, but at different times. They didn't all do it. It wasn't a sudden realization that everybody came to, oh my God, we're living a lie, like this book says, and that our government is lying to us. It's based on lies. There's nothing true about this. There's nothing good about a communist dictatorship or a fascist dictatorship. But people reach these. Some people never reach it. Some people are prepared to go along to get along for their whole lives. I think what you're asking me actually is not even a political science. It's a human nature question. And I don't really have the answer for it. I can only tell you my own experience. That I have now regrets about what I did a few months ago. And that now, no, I'm not going to just listen to public health officials. But most people did what I did.
Right.
If you look at Ontario, yeah. They went along to get along.
When we met for coffee, and I was trying to get to the why. What motivates people? Not, and the point you're trying to make, I think, is people are motivated by something in order to go along to get along. And it's not about what is the right thing to do. How do we handle there's some goods, there's some bad, maybe which one is worse, but they're not, are they actually going, I'm going to weigh out Hitler and he comes out on the side of, okay, I'll support him because his good outweighs his bad. Are they actually making an intellectual decision, or are they being driven by something else? And when we met over coffee, your conclusion to all of this is actually it's people are motivated by fear.
Oh, I think in Germany there was a great fear among the vast bulk of the population, because they could actually see it. What is that expression that has been used even in Western countries? When your neighbor loses his job, it's a recession. If you lose your job, it's a depression. But of course, in the interim, while you're seeing maybe 5 neighbors lose their jobs, you're getting scared because you're saying, when's the jig up for me? I think there was I think that people are primarily motivated by fear, and sometimes just. Yeah, I mean, sometimes it's hard to tell the difference even between fear and self-interest. I mean, so you start weighing things. Okay, yeah, maybe I won't lose my job if I'm in Germany, right? Maybe I'll be okay. I'm in the steel industry and I've been working at this plant a long time, and yeah, maybe I'll be okay. But, I saw 10 years ago the price of bread would cost 87 times more than I could afford now. So do I really want to trust these current people? This guy says he has a plan. Some of it sounds a bit wacko, but he says he actually has a plan. And maybe I should, in the absence of any other real good choices, maybe I should trust this guy. Again, I think a lot of people had the mistaken assumption that even somebody like Hitler could be controlled. I mean, and it wasn't just the average Joe working in the steel plant or in a coal mine. it was very sophisticated, educated German elites who said, not to worry. In fact, they told President Hindenburg that. I've seen some of the minutes of the meetings with between Hindenburg and some of his bureaucratic staff. And they're saying, you know what? Yeah, the guy's very radical and, he's somewhat distasteful, but it's just going to be him and a couple of he's going to be the chancellor. It's going to be him and a couple of other Nazis in the cabinet. The other 12 people are going to be good, solid German conservative people, Mr. President. Don't worry about it. We're going to keep this guy on a short leash. Boy, were they wrong. But that was what they believed.
Yeah, they believed it, and yet Hitler had made his agenda very clear. And so they basically thought, no. So they ignored a serious danger, a serious threat for some other reason. And I like the way you talked about fear versus self-interest. And I have my own theory about fear. I talk about it from time to time, is fear. Like, not everyone who's operating under fear feels afraid. They've manipulated their lives in such a way to avoid what they're afraid of. And so therefore they actually feel quite secure because of the protections they've put around themselves. But they're there because they're afraid, right?
Right.
But they're not feeling afraid now. So we just tell them, oh, you're doing this because you're afraid. They say, no, I'm not afraid. But they're completely motivated by what you've called self-interest. And when we do that, and we're not really thinking about the common good, we're not thinking about our neighbor, we're not really thinking about our families long term. Like, we might be thinking about our money in the bank, but we're not really thinking about what these decisions are going to mean for our loved ones for the long term. We've got our eyes on self and the immediate, and that's how we end up being seriously duped. And we basically sell our souls to the devil, whether metaphorically or actually. That's what's actually going on.
I think you're 100% correct. I mean, I think that's what we do too often. In the case of the German people, I mean, I would say there was it's obviously self-interest. If you look at your neighbors and you see one by one, the dominoes are falling and they're all losing their jobs, you've still got yours. I do think there's an element of self-interest. If you say, well, that guy says that's not going to happen to me if I vote for him. So there's a self-interest, but you're also at that point I think operating in a kind of a general atmosphere of fear, because you're saying, if I don't vote for him, I could be next. I'm the one who's going to be on the chopping block next. But I think there's always a kind of a combination, I guess, or elements of both in people's political decisions. I mean, I don't really know the answer to human nature. I think human nature being what it is, I suspect our first instinct, again, by my recent personal experience, will be go along to get along. And I don't consider myself a coward. I mean, I'm not a physical coward. I go hunting in bear-infested woods with a bow and arrow. So I'm not a physical coward. I mean, I know what a bear can do to me, and it disturbs me if I think about it a little bit, but I do it. Maybe because I have an overestimation of my skill as a marksman. It doesn't matter. But yet, if you were to tell me, well, and I'm looking at our economy now, and I'm saying, wow, I'm a little worried that we are going to descend into some kind of a pretty deep recession, and it's going to last a while. It's not going to be one of these 6 months and done things. I don't think we're going to end up in a Great Depression like my parents did in the 1930s, but I do think we're in for some very hard times, and that scares me a little bit or worries me a little bit. It's not enough to make me, if some right wing or left wing wacko party came in and said, I've got the answer to this, I'd say, yeah, right. I'm going to stick with what I know. But, after 10 years of that, I would hope I wouldn't vote for the wackos, but I can't answer that question now. I hope I never have to face it.
Yeah. Well, so this is why I'm doing the Thinking Biblically podcast, because I believe that the Bible actually has what we need to be able to navigate these difficulties. Certainly, the Bible speaks against go along to get along. The Bible speaks into our fears and calls us to live sacrificial, otherly lives. I don't think enough of us realize how much the Bible calls us to think for ourselves, not completely independently for ourselves, but that we're not to be manipulated by the forces around us. We should be able to analyze the situations that we're in and come to very clear, intelligent, and godly decisions about things. Sometimes those decisions will be more popular than other times. But even the fact, whether right or wrong on your part, you looked at what you decided medically with regard to the vaccine, and then come to the point of, I didn't do that for the right reason. I don't think that was an informed decision. I'm going to take a different approach now. I get the impression that, and for many of us, and I'm a dad, my wife and I raised all these kids. When I've made a decision about my children, and I've punished them or on the other allowed something to later on go, you know what? That was the wrong thing to do. And maybe I should apologize for doing the punishment or doing the permissive thing, and take and allow myself the humility to admit I did wrong, and now we're going to take a different course. It seems to me we live in a day you're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to get on your track and you're supposed to stay on it. And we call that integrity when it's not. We need to be people of truth and be people who are humble enough to change course when necessary. And I want to plead with the people listening and watching this that to look at what's going on, whatever it is, and whether in a little microcosm of your own personal life and your family, but in the bigger things too, to be able to, are we dealing with monsters out there, and how do we address them? No matter how popular they might be getting, and do the hard thing and make the hard decisions.
Yeah, I mean, I think that speaks to how the kind of lives really that we all should strive to live. We are at various times going to fall short. It's inevitable. But yeah, I think we should strive to live that way. It's as one of the advantages and disadvantages that you have when you're a professional historian, of course, is the advantage or disadvantage of hindsight. And yes, we should have, as individuals, we should, I guess you called it the humility. We should have, I would say, even to some extent, it is integrity to admit when we're wrong. We should be able to do that without, kind of defending something that's indefensible to the last possible minute. We should do that. We should be able to do that. I think there are things in Scripture that point us that way and should point us away from go along to get along. I think that's true. But again, I would point out, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a political scientist or a sociologist. Human nature being what it is, it may well be that our first impulse is to go along to get along, because it's easier. Because the first thing even if we're not wired that way, maybe the first thing that comes to mind is, how do I best protect my family, as an example? So for, again, the German steel worker in Dusseldorf or whatever, Darmstadt or whatever in 1932, maybe he's thinking that, and he's saying, okay, how do I best protect my family? Well, I need to keep my job. How do I do that? Well, there's all these parties to vote for in the upcoming federal elections here in Germany. And maybe, I have some doubts about this guy, but in the interests of my family, in the interests of keeping that job, maybe he's got the answers that all these other politicians who I've been voting for 10 years, 12 years, whatever, maybe they don't. Maybe they don't know what they're doing. So, it's not necessarily evil what some of these people did, by voting for it. I think,
and this, our first inclination unto the people that we're with should be to connect, to keep peace, and I think that's all good, and that's the good part of human nature. But at the same time, we need to be alerted that there really is evil in the world, and not everybody is our friend, and not everybody has our best interests in mind, and there are economic and political factors to deal with. And I wish this whole life thing was a lot easier than it is. And the warning is, and most of the time, you know what? We should go along to get along. You're with your buddies, and you're out there, and you're playing a game, and somebody wants to do it this way, and another person wants to do it that way. Like, let's not make a big deal about everything. Like, not everything has to. We don't have to be independent thinkers all the time with everybody. We don't need to be a nuisance or the sore thumb, or however you want to call it. We shouldn't be arrogant and pushy and all that sort of thing. But then there are these other serious things and what's interesting is, most of us, if we take a deep breath, we know there's something fishy going on. And some of these things need more careful thought to go, well, are we dealing with a niggly problem, or are we dealing with a monster that's going to take over? And that's part of what we're talking about here. And I want to encourage people for our own day, what is really going on, be alerts, and don't just go into the gear of go along to get along. And, this is how I live, leave me alone, because that gear is going to take us over the cliff.
Yeah, I mean, there's enough examples, I guess, in history where people, maybe even sometimes with what they perceive to be good intentions, made terrible choices. And yet, at the time, without the benefit of hindsight, it took a certain foresight, or it took a certain, I guess, willpower to go against the grain. It's not easy to do, because I think one of the things that's interesting about the modern life is that I guess we always assume that things will always, at least in our society, our kids' lives will be better than our life. Like, there will always be progress. Things will always improve. Ultimately, we may sometimes take a step or two back, but that we are on this inevitable course to betterment. And unfortunately, that's, I guess, I'm increasingly learning. I learned it to some extent as a historian, and maybe I'm still learning it, is that that's not true.
Right.
Maybe first of all, we have to, I think, always know what is progress. I mean, a German in 1935 would have said, as the German economy was beginning to get more robust and everybody was working, your full employment, a German would have said, hey, he's progress. That's progress, because look where we were in 1931, right? 4 years later, full employment, I've got money in the bank. I can take little vacations. I put money down on a car, I've got all this stuff to look forward to, things are good, yeah, okay, I can't vote anymore. And some of my Jewish neighbors, are seem to be kind of marginalized. I've sort of lost touch with them because, they sort of stay to themselves now. I guess I feel a little bad about that, but, life goes on, right? It's that going along to get along thing. But this idea of, I think, of progress, right? So a lot of people in Germany, and most people, I guess, before the war in 1935, 36 would have said, yeah, this is progress. We're better off now. That famous line from one of the American presidential elections, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago, right? Well, if somebody had asked the average German that, they would have said, yes, absolutely. The fact that I can't vote anymore, well, who cares, right? And then also, yeah, this idea, I guess, that we have this notion that progress should or is inevitable. Well, I've certainly come to question that.
Yeah, yeah. And I think, nobody wants to be a party pooper.
Yeah.
And it's who's going to be the one to say the emperor has no clothes? And so anyway, on that note, I just want to thank you for doing this with me today. And obviously we could have been talking a lot longer, and maybe you can come back sometime. We can explore some of these or other subjects again. Other subjects again? You know what I mean. We'll do this again to explore other subjects. So Howard, thank you so much for doing this.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. It was very interesting. Very stimulating, as always, when we have discussions. So
very good.
Thanks.
Well, I hope other people have been so stimulated. And if you have any questions, you can contact me at comments@thinkingbiblically.org. If you have any comments or questions for Howard, he's requested that you send them to me and I'll pass them on to him. And so again, you can email me at comments@thinkingbiblically.org, or you can put comments in the comment section below.